Cool. All right, so as people are starting to come in, maybe I'll just get the event going. So I'll give Sam as much time for let me just also pin myself. I'm new to using pins, so please bear with me. So hello, welcome to the 7th gathering from the Sydney Speculative Futures Meetup. To give you a bit of background, we started in 2020, right before the pandemic, when we were able to gather in person. We are part of the Speculative Futures initiative. We're part of a global meetup, and this is a Sydney chapter. We are really happy to meet everyone. You see, we've got Sam talking here. We've also got two organizers with me, Olivia and Atia, who just joined the team. So feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. Super happy to have you. So the meetup is about speculative design or anything future, foresight, design fiction. And we're really excited to invite other practitioners who aren't only in the design industry, but we want to really expand on different people who practice different materialities from, art, writing. The first meet and greet we ran, we had urban planners who, it's just nice to have those conversations. We'd love to eventually collaborate with everyone and do a little play sessions, but we'll keep that too at the end. So welcome. And I'll do a little quick acknowledgement of country. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land. I'm on the land of Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, which I'm on today, and pay our respects to the eldest, past, present, and emerging. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today. If you want to share where you currently based on and make your own acknowledgement country, we'll love to see that. So first thing, also, to get the conversation going, can't wait to get out of lockdown. Would love to hear what are the first things that you want to do once lockdown's over. I would like to just eat out outside of my house, or maybe a grass patch. That would be great. So that's what I'm going to do. So today's agenda. So the talk will begin just in a minute. So we'll do a half an hour talk by Sam today, and we'll do a little Q&A session afterwards, and then wrap up with a little bit of announcement, and then the event ends. Pretty straightforward. So today we've got Samuel Yu. Sam and I met over coffee over LinkedIn, like how we connected. We had a really great conversation at the start of starting this meetup, and he told me about cool projects that he's been doing along with his PhD. So he's going to give us a talk about reverse archaeology, designing things from the future. And I will leave the floor to Sam. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to hand it to Sam now.
Cool, thanks, Tina. Let me get mine going. Is that up? Cool. So welcome everyone. Thanks for coming today. Just a little bit about me before I get into things. As Tina sort of introduced already, so I'm doing my PhD at UTS at the moment in design futuring. So I'm exploring critical ways of visioning for transition, critical in the sense that I'm particularly interested in questioning and also getting people to question the desirability of the visions which we claim are desirable to transition towards. I also teach featuring at UTS in the BCI schools and also in the design school. And my sort of industry day job is with the Center for Inclusive Design. I'm currently taking a bit of a break from that at the moment to focus on the research and the teaching. If you want to stalk me on socials and stuff, it's Mr. Samuel Yu, and I have a website where I've been trying to do a little bit more writing, so perhaps this might be a good push for me to publish a little bit more. But to get into things, I'll be talking about my honors research as opposed to what I'm doing for my PhD at the moment. And this was done back in 2019, which seems like a very long time ago. Here are some of the images from the work and that I'll be getting into more detail soon. Essentially, what I was looking at was exploring the role of product design within speculative design practices as an emerging field of design. And this resulted in a whole range of sort of fun artifacts, and also some co-design sessions where I invited other people to come in and make speculations of their own and then turn them into more diegetic prototypes. I have prepared this talk under the premise that there will be people who people here unfamiliar with speculative design and design futuring. And so when Tina and I were planning this, we thought it'd be a good opportunity as I talk through this project as a way to introduce these aspects of design by sharing these examples of what it looks like in practice, especially because it's not particularly common in Sydney, let alone as a whole thing. So I will start by providing some high order definitions just to set the context for the people who are new to this, and also present some of the research findings that came out before I sort of launch into all the speculations in more detail. I think this will just help to set a level of understanding for those unfamiliar, and also help you make better sense of things when I go through the designs. In the context of this talk, and also aligning with how the Speculative Futures group defines speculative designing, I'll be referring to design practices that explore future possibilities, particularly through the use of designerly activities like prototyping, creating scenarios and storyboards and all those sorts of methods. Within this space, there is quite a lot of debate around the specifics and the nuances of each different form of speculative design, like the difference between critical design and speculative design, or design fiction and experiential futures. Because of all of these, it has sort of been bannered by some scholars under the term of discursive design, just to make things simpler. But what discursive design refers to is the use of artifacts as provocations for reflection and deeper thought. So objects are designed and deployed as a way to invite and prompt some kind of intellectual response from the viewer. Discursive objects don't necessarily have to be from the future, but the ones that are what we call diegetic prototypes. And the idea behind this being that we bring a speculative thing from the future into our present as a way to better engage with the ideas and the concepts of the future in which they belong and they represent. The futurist Stuart Candy has called this bridging the experiential gulf between the present and the future. Design objects help us to better envision these alternatives by providing these prompts in a material form, as opposed to just relying on either our imaginations or more conventional formats like using words or just images. So that's the lecture section of this talk. For a bit of backstory, I did my undergraduate degree in product design, which was largely focused on how to design things which sat in the commercial or responsible or experimental fields here, as outlined by the THARPs. The fourth one being discursive design. And I had heard of discursive practices like speculative designing or critical designing throughout the degree, but I didn't really know what they were, and especially how they could be used to create impact beyond creating these sort of interesting and creative bits of work, but often get critiqued as being too trivial and in some extents even useless at times. So doing honors gave me this freedom to explore more of what this field was and what it could do, especially in the face of exploring all the wicked ecological and social crises that designers are attempting to tackle now, recognizing that new ways of designing should be explored in order to create new futures. We can't just design in the same old fashion. So this research sits at the intersection of product design and design futuring. I'm using the term product in a very broad sense here, not just to mean industrial, but also UX and packaging. It extends to visual communication. This also can be expanded to things like service design. There has been some recent work on speculative service designing. But essentially what I set out to do was explore what it meant to do product design and to be a product designer within a design futuring space. And what I found was that there is a huge role for product designing, because at the end of the day, all designing is futuring. Design inherently involves speculations and speculating, and it is through design that we physically make futures happen. Where product design comes into this is with a specialized knowledge of how people interact with things in creating form and exploring aesthetic, and most importantly, making and constructing and prototyping. So to me, diegetic prototype isn't just about representing things from future worlds, but it's to be able to construct and think through what these future worlds could be. So Cameron Tonkerwise, who some of you might be familiar with, is a design scholar at UTS. He's also one of my supervisors. He wrote that all designing that doesn't already do all of these things is inadequate designing, because design should always be concerned with alternative possibilities, which in other words means being concerned with futures. One of the key things that came out of my research was the development of what I've called the diegetic design framework. I'll quickly outline what this is, and then I'll get into the examples to explain it in a bit more detail, but this basically outlines key components and things to think about when creating discursive diegetic artifacts as a way to prompt reflection. And so it's all about a balance between these four elements, so a balance of aesthetic in creating a tension of estrangement between familiarity and estrangement, which then provokes the viewer's intellectual response. There's a level of implied functionality, implied because it's a future object that most likely wouldn't work in the present, but in some cases there would be some real level of function in there. It's also about finding the right level of fidelity and how refined this object is, and that contributes to the level of realism and the experiential aspect of these artifacts. And finally, also just having supporting artifacts, because the object alone usually isn't enough to present the full speculation. And these could be depictive things like videos or photos of it in a particular context, or also just plain explanatory documentation, like the actual question prompt of what this future is, or just a straight up explanation in words of the future scenario that it's supposed to exist within. And so I'll talk through some of these examples now through the work and explain how I came about this framework. So the first speculation that I was exploring was lab-grown meat, and that sort of sets the context for the entire thing in terms of the space of which I was exploring. And the first thing that came was the domestication of this lab-grown meat technology, which currently only exists in industrial and commercial form. Now, this isn't a particularly creative or big imaginative leap. Many designers before me have explored this idea. Domesticating commercial technology isn't a particularly uncommon discourse. Speculative work in this case sort of dates back into the very early speculative design days when Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby, who were pioneers of the field, were teaching at RCS. So James King was one of their students in the Designing Interactions course, and he created this project, Dressing the Meat of Tomorrow, where he was exploring what form lab-grown meat might take. So he created this mold, which was designed after an MRI cross-section of a cow, so that the shape of the meat could still be representative of the animal of which it came from. Lab-grown meat, of course, doesn't necessarily need to take the form of a cow specifically, because it's not actually grown as a cow. It's grown under lab conditions in some sort of petri dish kind of thing. But the two examples that I was more focused on are the meat incubator and the cultivator. What I found interesting about these was that despite being presented as domestic lab meat appliances, they're all very generic looking, sort of clinical sciencey devices, which didn't really reflect a domestic aesthetic. One of them sort of looks like a pressure cooker, but it lacks a lot of the detail. And the other one is quite literally just an iPad on a white box. And so being a product designer, what I did was I set out to redesign this machine, redesign this speculation, so that would actually be more engaging as a provocative case of a household appliance. So this was a bit of a mood board of which I was working through to come to the final design. And it was an aesthetic balance that I was trying to find between this high-tech science feel, but with a very usable, approachable household domestic appeal to it as well. And I sort of took examples from a lot of science fiction. So the pizza rehydrator from Back to the Future is a great example of this. And it's actually surprisingly well documented as a bit of sort of film memorabilia in the Back to the Future space. There's also I can't remember the name of it, but the thing from Star Trek, which pretty much generates whatever food you want. I was also looking at domestic 3D printing as kind of an analogous example of technology that's existing nowadays. Breville does a really good job in terms of balancing the sort of commercial kitchen aesthetic in a domestic setting. There is also, of course, just straight up what the technology of lab-grown meat looks like there as well. And I did find one other speculation of lab-grown bacon, which I think did a much better job than the other two in sort of representing this future as a designed object. So this went through a couple of different sort of iterations of form, and as I was sort of exploring what it could look like, a lot of this sort of was modeled off coffee machines and other appliances. Eventually, I ended up going with this microwave sort of looking thing with a big viewing window at the bottom, at the front, which you could watch the meat growing. There was a light underneath it that would glow. A key part of this design was actually the interface on the top, which gives that sense of implied functionality, which the others didn't really have, although sort of the iPad was where everything happened on that project. There is a bioreactor chamber with like a little spinny paddle there, which agitates the sort of, the meaty, bloody red fluid up the top. And there's a test tube where you would presumably kind of put the cells of which animal that you're trying to grow and eat. And there's also an on button and a touch screen. So these small product detail refinements is what contributes to that sense of realism when looking at this object. And so this is the final result that came out from it. Like I said, there was small details added to refine the level of fidelity. There was an actual interface that I designed quite simply. I put a power cable on it, made this panel in the back, which sort of made it seem like you could get into it to look at the electronics. I whacked a brand label on it. There are all the sorts of little things which add to the sense of realism, which otherwise, without it would have just been another sort of cylindrical white box. At the same time, it still attempts to remain quite unfinished to balance that sense of fake and real. There's a lot of empty white space, which was intended to make it look unfinished, which would then invite people to speculate about things. I should also make a note at this point that it's all very subjective, and that's one of the beauties and difficulties of designing. Some people might find this super realistic, others not so much. But yeah, so the prompt itself there being the sort of supportive explanatory artifact, what if we could grow our own meat at home? This itself directly raises that question and also sets the speculative scene and puts the picture in people's minds. Alongside this, I also created a very short video to sort of highlight how this thing works. I do apologize, there is no sound because I couldn't find the file. So that was a very quick and roughly made video to just showcase how this future object might exist and how people might interact with it. And what I think this also does, now that I sort of reflect upon it, is it's a really good example of how something less refined begins to detract from the engagement. So science fiction and filmmaking has a strong and connected history with design featuring, and this obviously isn't at that Hollywood Black Mirror kind of level of refinement in speculation. But by providing this video and depicting that object in use, it does help to provide a better glimpse of what the future might be, as opposed to just having the object as a standalone thing. And so, which brings me to the next speculation, building on top of the first one through a process of which has been called re-anticipating. So one of the issues with a lot of speculative design is that it gets made, it gets its time in the spotlight, usually just amongst a very small niche group of already speculative designers. If they're even more amazing, they might get a chance to go into a museum. So that James King project actually belongs to the MoMA collection now. But again, it's most likely hidden in the archives as opposed to actually being displayed. Some speculations make it out into the media, but beyond that, most of them sort of fade away and aren't really spoken about after the fact, which sort of literally makes them useless, because if they're not there to prompt people to engage in the discourse, well, then there's no point of having that object as a thing. So by re-anticipating, we can bring these past speculations back into the front of mind, in putting them in front of people to then build new speculations on top of these, to then iterate and then create new questions and new futures and new prompts to think through. And so building on top of the domestic machine, the question which was raised is, how would you sort of actually create the meat? Where would you actually source it? Which led to the prompt of, what if you could eat any animal without slaughter? Because in the case of lab-grown meat, you don't actually have to farm and kill an animal to get the meat. All you need is to pop a syringe in, get some cells, and you grow it in a lab setting. And a large part of this was also trying to address the ethical implications of meat eating culture and how this technology might influence the practices associated with eating meat. So what I ended up creating was the Darwin Lab Company after Charles Darwin, who claimed that apparently the Galapagos tortoises were delicious. And as the story goes, apparently they couldn't even get them back to England to study because everybody ended up eating them on the trip. So that might be one of the reasons why it's contributed to their level of endangerment and near extinction. But other animals as part of this speculation were also the whale, which is cultural delicacy in Japan and Scandinavia. And there's a lot of discourse around whether or not that should be allowed and the taboo cultures associated with that. And the final one also there being the Komodo dragon, which again is also endangered, but also a very dangerous animal that isn't really hunted, and I doubt very many people have even considered it as a source of food, but through this technology, potentially it could. This sort of speculating could really go on forever. You can think about dogs, eating dogs, or even eating humans. Like, would you consider taking cells from yourself and eating yourself, for example? Working through the design of the Darwin Lab Company, I was exploring the packaging of which it might come in. So aesthetically, I was trying to balance this scientific element again, but with a sense of luxury in consuming these endangered species. And then linking back to the design of the appliance, I was thinking through sort of capsule coffees as a way to deliver these cells into the machine, as a way of sort of plug and play meat growing in the home. Cosmetics and pharmaceutical branding also was a really good analogous example of work that's balancing science and sort of luxury desirability. And I also sort of looked at some food products with this sense of a minimalist luxury that a lot of millennials kind of are attracted to. The label design itself went through quite a few versions until I ended up with this idea of using these close-up microscopic images of actual cells to highlight that scientific element. But by zooming in and really abstracting these images, they created these really nice, interesting patterns and textures, which actually lent its hand to that kind of branding style that I was going after. Beyond this, I was also thinking about the package as a product itself, as a physical thing. So I was looking into box design of all things. I pulled apart iPhone packaging, which is so unnecessarily high quality, which is what gives it that sense of luxury. And so I was playing around with different card stocks and different card textures that could be used for this box. And it's a bit hard to see, but in the black photos there's sort of like a really nice silk mat inside with a bit of a crumbly outside texture. Beyond this, I was also exploring what the sort of labels might look like. So I wrote some sort of tasting notes as a descriptor for the Komodo dragon. It might be a little bit gamey, or it might be a little bit smoky. Those sorts of words that are usually used to evoke the senses when we talk about food, and also putting in some nutritional information just to add those little details which contribute to the level of realism. And in the end, there was one of the very early prototypes that I made, which again sort of reflects how the level of refinement and the fidelity of these objects contribute to engagement. So this isn't particularly realistic until I got to this final result here. I ended up getting real test tubes, but I created this sort of custom foam insert which would hold them all in place and sort of displaying the labels up when you slide it open from the packaging. The colors of the liquid themselves represented the animal, sort of red for the dragon, blue for the whale, green for the tortoise. I even went down to sort of the shading to sort of get to tweak it to that right level. The final pattern that I ended up going with for the outside box is kind of gross, but also kind of cool, just to play with that sense of estrangement with appeal. And I also then added a safety sticker to the seal of the box, which comes with that sort of standard do not consume if broken, because this is biomaterial and possibly reactive. And there was also some copy that was written on the back of the box, which continuing to play on the metaphor of food writing. I sort of wrote about how sustainably sourced and how well treated these animals are before the cells are extracted, and how that results in a better tasting meat. And part of the profits would go back to like animal conservation or something, just to really drive home that kind of ethical dilemma of eating an endangered species. And so there is another video which is an ad essentially for the company here. I was trying to juxtapose animals with food. You will have to sort of imagine a chef's table style classical music playing over the top, which will make more sense once you watch it. So in this video, I was just essentially very simply trying to progressively highlight the juxtaposition between these animals and food. And towards the end, you'll see that I put increasingly cuter animals and also Australian animals in there just to really highlight that point. All those food shots were taken directly from chef's table, so they were like super aesthetic. This thing doesn't want to load. Come on. Next slide. There we go. So following on from that, the previous speculations were all done sort of individually by myself to explore these areas of practice. The next stage of this research involved inviting others to re-anticipate and to create new speculations. So I ran 2 workshops with a mix of designers and also non-designers. These participants, who I think some of them are here today, so thanks for coming, and you might see yourself in the photos. These people had very little to no prior experience of doing speculative design. And so they were guided through a series of activities, which prompted them to explore social practices associated with eating meat and teasing out the potential implications of introducing this lab growing technology into those practices. So there was a very wide range of really interesting things that were brought up, which unfortunately couldn't all get explored, and I can't get into all in the context of today either. One of them was exploring the idea of meat as a focal point in many of our sort of celebratory eating practices. So things like Australia Day barbecues and lamb, turkeys for Thanksgiving and Christmas. So very interesting sort of socio-cultural implications associated with meat, all of which are valuable and important for exploration. What I ended up focusing on was this one, which became the body shop, and the provocation here was, what if you could grow entire parts of animals, including humans? And so what this group was focusing on was gym culture and the consumption of meat in very large quantities for protein. But rather than just considering how lab-grown meat might result in us being able to perhaps more sustainably produce meat in larger quantities, or perhaps we could pack more protein into a steak. They pushed it even further, and they were asking how whether or not the technology could be used to grow just straight up human muscle. So could we just skip the middleman of having to consume the protein and just grow the muscles that we want on our bodies, and not have to go to the gym and go through all that kerfuffle? So they proposed this body part solarium in association with the body shop, where you could get onto the app, swipe through it like some sort of Tinder for bodies, find the most desirable muscles that you'd want on yourselves, and then have them sort of grafted directly onto you. And the prototype of the object that they ended up designing was this body part solarium, a bit of a Captain America kind of thing, where you go in and then you come out all transformed. And they also created that little storyboard here to show the journey of this person, trying to diet, failing, watching TV. He sees this ad, gets onto the app, DMs them for a sample. They send him the syringe, tries it on with a sort of VR changing room kind of thing, goes to the body shop, gets injected, comes out massive, and then probably could even then sell themselves back on the app. But what I realized when going through this, and when the participants were creating these designs, particularly when they built the little model here, is that rough sketch models like this, particularly ones that are crafty, made with Play-Doh and Lego and pipe cleaners and bits of stuff from Daiso, is that they're very rough and they aren't very reflective of real scale, for one. which means that they're not particularly engaging as a representation of a future world. This level of early prototyping is a good way to sort of start teasing out and exploring some things, but it really lacks the required level of detail that contributes to the realism that makes diegetic prototypes intriguing and inviting and interesting to look at, which then prompts that level of reflection. When you just look at this, you can't really tell that it even is a body part solarium, one, because it is tiny, and two, because it just barely sort of implies a level of form. And so this is where product design skills really come in and shine, because what product designers can do is flesh out the details of these diegetic prototypes. And reflecting on this, one of the other questions which sort of still remains unanswered in terms of speculative practice from here is, what level of commitment or required engagement is a non-designer needed for? So here, the speculation itself has already been provided. What's left in terms of the work to be done is for a skilled designer to come along and basically take the idea and then turn it into something that's a lot more engaging. But here, that this again raises more questions of how might the speculation change when it sort of gets handed over. Should the sort of person who initially created the provocation still remain in that design process to continue the participatory co-design, or can the designer sort of take the responsibility over of just refining what others have done? And this is sort of something that I could choose to explore in my further research, or some of you guys might want to explore in your own work as well, but it remains unanswered in literature as well. On top of all of this, I wouldn't have been able to build a full-size human solarium, but also I didn't really need to, because that wasn't the only diegetic prototype that was put forward in this future. There were other things which could have been selected as a representative artifact. So going back to the storyboard, there are things like the TV ad, there's the app itself, there's possibly the syringe and the package of the cells that come in the mail, there's the VR changing room thing, there's the actual interior of the body shop if you want to go to that like full experiential sense. What I ended up picking was the app, because that was a lot more feasible to do, and also something that I would sort of have the UX UI skill to actually develop, as opposed to trying to make this full-sized. In many ways, it would have been kind of a coffin. But I took the idea and turned it into an app instead of the physical thing of the solarium. And this actually benefited because I was able to explore more interaction and also present a level of sort of a dynamic feel for the engagement. So there were features on the app which then allowed the story to be told in a much more engaging way, such as using onboarding screens, which explains what the app does, which then helps to sort of set the scene a little bit more. By flicking through the different screens, it tells you the story of how someone could browse different body parts, order them, find their nearest body shop to be transformed and pay and all of that. And this sort of drew from a lot of existing design, app designs, which again, I went with a bit of a minimalist aesthetic because that was sort of the trend and possibly still is at the time. And that really is a bit more of a reflection of sort of the politics in visual design in the present, really, let alone in the past, sorry, in the future. But this again also raises another question of sort of how does the choice of tone and style reflect, and what does that say about this future story world in which you create? If I went with a bit more of a sort of dystopian, darker, grittier Minority Report feel, then could perhaps this future world be entirely different? And someone appears to be drawing all over the thing. But anyway, this was the final result of the app, which I mocked up on Figma, balancing a very simple kind of wireframey, bare bones aesthetic with a level of sort of sufficient refinement in terms of detail. Looking back on it now, I'm sort of wondering whether or not I could have stripped even more of it back, which then sort of raises the question of like, what is the sort of MVP of diegetic prototype? What's the minimum level of speculating that you need to do? But the key area here was the sort of visual tension of displaying body parts as sort of inventory. So there's a search filter for different body parts. There's also different descriptors of what kind of person they came from, whether they were sort of a gym nut weight lifter, or whether they sort of have a swimmer's body with like washboard abs. And again, this is a reflection of body shapes and cultures around that. I even found this actual app which would Photoshop abs onto pictures that you uploaded, which worked out really well for my work. But again, another reflection upon sort of body culture of today, let alone in the future. But to then push this estrangement a little bit further, I then added a child option into the app. And this sort of then was starting to try and tie back to thinking around the ideas of CRISPR and genetic modification and designer babies. And so here's the final video here.
And do you want to stop sharing your screen and share again? I don't know. I have no control getting rid of the...
I think it'll be fine. So yeah, that was obviously the guy in the final shot didn't have as big biceps as the person in the image, but that was I think James Magnuson is like one of the Olympic swimmers at the time, and I couldn't find anybody at uni with that big of biceps. And so that's the project. Those were the 3 speculations that were cumulatively built upon one another to highlight the re-anticipation of things and to highlight how to explore in greater depth the product design knowledge and skills which contribute to creating more engaging artifacts, which then hopefully have promoted a level of intellectual reflection into these ideas. So thanks.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, I will take you off the pin mode so everyone could see everyone. Thank you so much. That was, since we first spoke about the meetup, I've always wanted to hear about your project. We've got some questions here. And I'll start reading them out, and then I'll open up the floor if anyone wants to put their hand up. Or Justina, so you got a couple of questions here. Would you like me to read them, or would you like to read them yourself?
So all these ones in the chat here?
A couple.
Yeah, maybe, okay, yeah, maybe I'll just try it, knock them off in a row.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you don't mind reading them out, Sam.
Sure. So from Justin, I wanted to know if you engage with any in vitro meat companies or scientists to inform the details, or was I engaged in the literature on the topic, and why or why not? So I wasn't engaged with any actual sort of scientists in this, although at the time of research, the startup that exists in Sydney, Vow Foods, they're actually making lab-grown meat. And so I think it was either the same year or the year before, they actually made the first lab-grown kangaroo, and they sort of have this collaboration with, I think, Neil Perry. So I definitely could have like approached them to actually do this work, but I didn't necessarily feel like I needed to. I mean, it could be interesting to explore what, bringing that scientific realism could make, but I wasn't that focused on the technology itself, more so the sort of practices associated with the technology. I didn't feel that there was a need to really get into the nitty-gritty of how these things actually worked, which is why in the framework, it's an implied level of functionality. Like I personally have no idea how it's actually grown. I've got a reasonable idea from sort of literature and looking at videos that have been explained. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah, strong chef there was I, because I took it straight off of.
Yeah, and one more thing on that, I guess I also wonder, did you not engage with them because that then also aligns with the sort of like compliance and enabling aspect? Like, had you considered that, and was that part of also your decision to not do it, or just because you, as you said, it just wasn't a factor that was important?
It sort of didn't really hit me until very late. Like I didn't even realize that Vow Foods was doing this until quite late in the research. But I also just never had felt the need that it needed that level of groundedness. But yeah, sort of reflecting on that, it does sort of imply that by engaging with them in this work, I might be sort of what's the word I'm looking for? it escapes me, but basically saying that I agree with the technology and that I think it should be promoted. I, personally am not a fan of this sort of, techno-utopianism that comes with a lot of futuring, which is why I was much more interested in exploring the futures in and around the technology as opposed to it itself. Valfoods actually did, or still does, potentially have what they called it, like Noah's Ark, where they were trying to get cells of all the different animals. So like that, I think that's actually a really good example of speculative design that isn't even speculative. And that's something that I've been trying to reflect on lately as well, is that sometimes this sort of precautionary work gets almost misinterpreted as something that should be desirable. And James Auger hit the project hit that he did back at RCA with the sort of microchip in the tooth is the prime example of this for those familiar. It made the cover of Times magazine, being promoted as something that was super desirable, but what they were saying is that we probably wouldn't want this kind of a future.
I'll proceed to read the rest of the questions, and I'll open up the questions to the floor. But equally, if you have more questions, you prefer to put them in the chat, please do so. So we've got a question here from Eloise. As a designer, what might be the steps to create this speculative future? What design techniques could be used to normalize these potential future practices, such as eating endangered animals or non-traditional food meats?
Yeah, I mean, a few things to address in terms of that. And I think the main point that I want to say in response to this is that there aren't particularly new or different design steps to bring this into being, because designing is futuring. To bring this future into reality is to just continue designing. The difference there perhaps being by speculating into a much further future results in the new sort of temporal sense of how we think when it comes to designing. But in terms of techniques, it's just doing design, because by designing these things, if they were presented as desirable and we accepted them as desirable futures to want to transition towards, we would just simply design the technologies to bring that future into being. The question that all of these that the Darwin Lab company was prompting was, do you actually want to eat these endangered animals?
Yeah, I definitely think you draw a really good point about discursive design and the realism of the object that brings to it's that kind of level of conversation you want to bring into. And I've got a question here from Natalie. Thank you so much, Sam. That was really inspiring. What are some of the strategies you would like to try to engage the general public in a dialogue around speculative design and diegetic prototypes?
That is a great question, and is something that I'm trying to think through in my research at the moment, especially around participation and also critical participation, more importantly. In terms of strategies, that's been one of the sort of the big things that have been happening in around this space of thinking. Like, this currently very much exists largely sort of either within universities or very small groups of communities, such as this one here, or particular design agencies that have only just really starting to produce these speculations, and a lot of time they're still just producing these very techno-utopic visions that aren't particularly critical about things. Strategies that I've been trying to consider is to employ deliberative democracy, so inviting citizens into citizens' juries and assemblies to engage them in this type of work. And this raises a whole lot of questions around the politics of this kind of work, who would be in charge of sort of assembling all these people, who would be invited to these gatherings to participate, and that again informs what kinds of futures are being considered here. To tie this into my work in inclusive design, the futures needs to be inclusive, because otherwise, if it's the same sort of people thinking about the same sorts of things, then that's eventually what's going to get designed, and that already exists now just in designing in and of itself. So yeah, deliberative democracy is probably the model of which I'm exploring myself. Other modes of designing in this fashion would be for pretty much everybody to adopt co-design, but again, within current forms of designing, especially in commercial designing, there are a lot of restrictions and a lot of politics to try and navigate to actually do that work in the ways that we would ideally want this speculating to happen. And so yeah, very many new ways of designing. It's as a practice need to explore, which then hopefully would be resultant from people trying to explore how we might get more people to engage in speculative practice itself.
Thank you. Here can relate. That's definitely something our work is trying to get more into too. One, pushing for futures and, doing participatory design. We got a question here from Bridget. This feels like an app from a normative future. Did you use any scenario archetypes for the design, or temporal context?
No, I personally didn't. And when you say archetypes, I'm going to assume that you're referring to sort of like datas for futures. So I didn't apply any of those sort of frameworks. All I really did was explore it through the lens of social practice theory, which if anybody's not familiar with, comes from sociology. And there are sort of three key aspects of it being the materials, which are the things that are involved in the practice, the competencies, which is the knowledge required to participate in the practice, and also the meanings or the cultural and social things associated with that practice. And they all interrelate, and different practices interrelate to one another. So that was sort of the framework that I was working through. I didn't propose any of the speculations as a sort of discipline or transformative notion. Perhaps in the ways that they were designed, they might have inherently been created as a potentially normative future, but I personally made no claim as to whether or not these futures were desirable. It was really used as just a prompt to question whether or not it would be. But of course, in any designing, there is some level of inherent politics from the creator. But I didn't set out to necessarily say this is that type of future and that I want that future.
On that note, before we move to Vincent's questions, to build on top of that, I wrote some notes around the questions I asked you. Throughout the sort of level of detail, such as like, the packaging and all the stories, and, thinking about, even the ads that you're creating during your design process, how much of the world and sort of the system that you build out into portraying these stories into objects, or versus how much of those exploration you did while you're creating those objects? Like, oh yeah, like what would the back of this say? Like what would the company ethos say? Like what would the vibe of those ads gonna say? Like what was the process around there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a really good sort of exploration of how this sort of work gets done. In terms of like story world building and the sort of wider systems, I actually didn't really do much of it. I very much came at it from the lens of I'm designing this object, and it's through the object itself that sort of revealed more aspects about this future world. But again, I didn't set out to create wider images of the future, very much to use just that object as sort of the entry point into what possible future worlds could be. So in exploring the different sort of little details, by changing one simple thing, like how the branding was created, like what the copy said, that would sort of imply a whole different set of associations.
Nice, thank you, Sam. So Vincent got a lot of questions here. Vincent, do you have a favorite question you asked, or I can just read all of them, and Sam, maybe you can just open up the chat. So Vincent here asks, what is the output of diegetic speculative design? Is it active or passive intellectual reflection of the audience, or is it the insight / key themes synthesized from qualitative discussion points, prototype exposure? This is asking for around matrix and ROI perspectives.
Yeah, I could probably try and quickly go through all of them. So in terms of the output of diegetic prototyping, well, one is the object itself, but in terms of it being a discursive practice, the output is the level and the sort of detail in intellectual response that you get as a result of people interacting with this thing, which sort of segues really well into your next question. And it's something that I've been thinking a bit through now still, is the activeness or the passivity of this engagement. So in a lot of traditional speculative designing, it's sort of just this thing that's proposed and it's put out into the world for people to look at as passive viewers. All of the reflecting that they do is all internalized, and in most cases not necessarily even shared with anybody, which is why I was bringing in re-anticipation and participation in the workshop as a way of actively getting people engaged in the discourse. I think, but both kind of work, because there's pros and cons of each. Like if we're just sort of putting things out there for a passive engagement, you can obviously get a much wider range of people looking at the work, as opposed to trying to engage people in active involvement, which would be limited to sort of how many people that you can directly engage with, and essentially get into a workshop setting or a citizens assembly. And the key insights and themes synthesized. So it all very much happened throughout and post. So this was a research by design project. So I was continuously reflecting on things as I was working through. And you can perhaps see from the ways that the things were designed that as I was sort of prototyping these things simultaneously, each different object informed the design aspects of the other objects. And so it was all a very interconnected way of featuring. In terms of the discussion points, yeah, most of them were essentially distilled during any actual discussion with people, particularly in the workshop. They were mostly post-it noted to get all of that documentation out. But in terms of reflection on theory, that was very much a looking back of all of the research that I did to then produce that kind of thesis hand-in that I had to do for the honors.
Nice. I'll open up the floor for other questions for our audience if you want to type into the chat or just ask straight up.
Tina, I actually had a question for you. Tying back to one of the earlier questions about how this kind of work could be employed, and that there are some companies trying to do this. You being one of the people trying to do this at Meld, like I'm curious to know more about your experience of trying to convince a consulting company to do this stuff.
I think, well, probably there's going to be like another talk someday. I recently gave, I think when I say recently, I mean like early in the year, because I forgot lockdown happened. I gave a pitch to the company. I spent a lot of the past 2 years translating the language of future design and speculative design into language that clients could understand. And there's a point in time that you can have these conversations. And there are 2 ways in high level you can go about it. Is you do the guerrilla style. You don't tell them what you're going to do. You just straight up put it in, part of your research, part of your prototype. But the key challenge of that is a lot of lead up and a lot of pre-work needs to be done. So there's an act of constantly, looking out for future trends and drivers, and then consolidating into a one-liner and a little story that use them as provocation. But you also need to, there's often the practice of, are you doing focus scanning that's specifically related to your client's industry, specific to the project you're trying to do, or are you trying to do a really broad scanning, which there are scholars and there are academics and there are people who dedicate and lock themselves in the room and do it for over 5 weeks, and then translate it into a report that, may or may not get used. So I think in short, it's really hard. We're recently trying to do some use the practice of featuring for our company inside to come up with, different visions, because we're at a point where, not to talk too much about my company, but we recently became an employee-owned company, and we are actually, looking at the next horizon, like what is our role as designers and as a consultancy. We actually just created a bunch of different feature visions with, I guess, a different level of discursive design, because we listed out all the, what kinds of capability, what's the shape and the size, and, what does our company even look like, to give fidelity to have really in-depth conversations. It's hard. I think it depends, first, it depends on the client appetite. I gave this talk, when I say last year, I mean 2019, at Primer. I actually broke it down on how to use speculative design pragmatically, and the language of describing it, I think, can't remember off the top of my head, but the 4 key things is using it as a gap analysis by getting into an aspiration statement and vision. Sometimes your company would have their own aspirational vision, and sometimes consultants comes in and create a vision just to interrogate. Then you come in to understand, like, what's the gap between current and future, And the second one is future envisioning. So from a strategic point of view, where they're trying to get to, it's about painting a picture towards the future, not to predict the future, but just give them some size and shape. Like, this is where we would like to get to collectively as a preferable future for, you know, all citizens or, you know, everyone in the company. I can't remember the third and fourth one. I gave this talk like a long time ago, but happy to share that at one point, but I'll stop there. Any other questions here from the room? Tia, Olivia?
No questions from me. That was just a fantastic talk. I think maybe while we've got everyone on the line, we hop into the next part. But if you've got any more questions for Sam, I'm sure Sam would be really open to getting in touch. Am I putting you on the spot?
No, yeah, for sure.
I will share my screen. This is so prepared, guys, so prepared. Okay, so here's how you get in touch with Sam. You can reach him through Twitter and Instagram, also LinkedIn, and you also visit Sam's website that he's been putting together. Lots of great stuff, I'm assuming. Well, I looked at it also. And then we are looking for speakers. As I've kind of, you know, talked a little bit about in the beginning, the community is still quite small. It is a really niche topic, and we're quite deliberate in differentiating, not doing too much design and practices because there's so many means already, but rather to explore the notion of speculative futures and foresight with different disciplines. So if you have any like cool projects or any cool stuff you're working on at the moment, we'll love to just get the community going and just hear the insights you have, even if just like, oh, I attempted to use this kind of methodology. I'll love to, you know, share it with you guys. What were the key challenges? Because from my time, even talking to people overseas and people have been like practicing this from in the academic field or, you know, in the consulting space, it is still quite niche, and then it is still a big challenge of how to bring it to life. So if you have any, anything that you want to share with us, please reach out to me. We can, you know, take it from there. And also, we also want to know what kinds of events you want to see more of the future. I've never done a poll before. I'll launch the poll, but before I do that, Sam actually prompted, we previously, with Damien Lutz, but a majority of the time I actually collated a bunch of different readings, resources, games, methodology that I'm dying to try, which is one of the things I'll put in the poll. I'll share at the end. You can look at this from our LinkedIn, but also share a little QR code at the end that you can reach to our socials. But before that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to start this poll. And we would love to know what kind of future events you would like to see more of the future. And so we can bring that to the table. And I'll just put a 5-minute timer on. Maybe it could be less than 5 minutes. I'll just do a 2-minute timer. Nice. And if there are other events that you're not seeing here, please pop them in chat. All right. And the experiment playground, the play and jam, is more, within the resources and games that we're piled up. We'd love to just run like casual sessions where people are just really getting together and play. I'm dying to find someone to play with me, on this stuff. Maybe eventually not virtually, but it'd be lovely to play in the same space.
I am personally also looking at different tools and methods to develop for my own research. So I think the community would actually be a great place to test these things out.
Okay, great. And meet and greet, just probably networking event so we can actually meet each other in person, hopefully. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Thank you. That's been very useful. And I got another quick poll here. It's in regard to how would you like to be kept updated with future events and conversations. Ignore the heading of newsletter. First time using poll. We have a global Slack channel, and you can find us on the Sydney channel as well. By signing up on the global Slack channel, you can also see what other chapters around the world is doing. You know, we got chapters in Asia, majority US started, also in Europe as well. Currently we post our events through Eventbrite, and we share them on LinkedIn as well. Trying to get on the Instagram, but you know, we'd love to know how we can best reach you. Okay, I would say that is the end. Cool, thank you everyone. If you will wrap up soon, and I will gotta remember to share all these links that we have. First time trying Linktree. If you come to Linktree, you can have access to our resources that I just put up, and also, you know, get access to Eventbrite and our LinkedIn pages, and then sign up to the global Slack and join us on the Sydney chapter. Thanks, Atia. Great. Well, I will stop sharing. And if anyone wants to stay, I'll stop recording as well.